From Seoul, Korea, KBS World Radio News Today starts right now.
On today's broadcast, with the Lunar New Year holiday set to begin on Thursday, South Korea reports more than 400 daily COVID-19 cases for the first time in 6 days. The government authorizes AstraZeneca's COVID-19 vaccine for all adults. And South Korea suffers the biggest on-year drop in employment in January in over 22 years. This is KBS World Radio News. I'm Emma Kalka. South Korea reported 444 new COVID-19 cases on Wednesday, once again hitting the 400s after 5 days below that number, as the long Lunar New Year holiday is set to begin on Thursday. The Korea Disease Control and Prevention Agency said on Wednesday that the new cases raised the country's accumulated caseload to 81,930. The daily figure, which fell to the 200 range earlier this week, appears to be climbing back up again with continued infection clusters in the capital region. Prime Minister Chung Se-kyun stressed that the upcoming holiday will be an important turning point in determining the direction of the third wave of the epidemic in the country. The Ministry of Food and Drug Safety has authorized AstraZeneca's COVID-19 vaccines for all adults, including seniors, on the condition the firm submits the results of Phase 3 clinical trials currently underway in the U.S. The ministry announced the results of a final assessment meeting on Wednesday involving 3 outside experts and 5 ministry officials, including Minister Kim Gang-rip. The committee concluded that most reported adverse reactions were predictable and no severe cases were reported among the elderly. However, the ministry has recommended that doctors exercise discretion when deciding to use the vaccine on seniors 65 and older, as there is still less data on efficacy from the trials in this age group. South Korea suffered its biggest monthly job loss in over 2 decades in January due to the fallout of the COVID-19 pandemic. According to Statistics Korea on Wednesday, the number of employed people reached 25.81 million last month, down 982,000 from a year earlier. That's the largest drop since December 1998, when it shed 1.28 million. The nation has reported job losses for 11 straight months since March of last year, the longest decline after it posted losses for 16 months from January 1998 to April 1999. A group of experts from the World Health Organization in China said on Tuesday that it has failed to find evidence that COVID-19 originated in the central Chinese city of Wuhan. The WHO China joint team conducted a scientific assessment of 4 possible routes as to how the virus was transmitted to humans. Bae Ju-yeon has more.
In a press conference in the city of Wuhan, a team of international experts from the World Health Organization and China tracing the origins of COVID-19 said that it has reached tentative conclusions after looking into what happened at the beginning of the outbreak and how the virus emerged and was transmitted to humans. Dr. Peter Ben Embarak, the head of the team from the WHO, said initial findings show the virus most likely jumped from an animal, such as a bat, to an intermediary host and then to humans, though more research is needed. However, the team failed to find evidence that COVID-19 originated in the central Chinese city of Wuhan, especially dismissing a controversial theory that it was leaked from a lab in the city.
The findings suggest that the laboratory incident hypothesis is extremely unlikely and to explain the introduction of the virus into the human population. And therefore it is not a hypothesis that will suggest, that will implies to suggest future studies into our work to support our future work into the understanding of the origin of the virus.
The team of international experts from the WHO arrived in Wuhan on January 14th to investigate the origins of the novel coronavirus and conduct joint research with Chinese scientists. The China-WHO joint mission consists of 17 Chinese experts and 17 experts from 10 other countries. As the investigation is ongoing, the team called on countries to expand the global virus database, including the genetic sequence data of related viruses. Pidgeon and KBS World Radio News.
There is mounting criticism over the World Health Organization's team of researchers failing to determine the origin of COVID-19 from their investigation in Wuhan, China. According to the Washington Post, Mark Lipsitch, a professor of epidemiology at Harvard's T.H. Chan School of Public Health, stressed that simply stating that the WIV has really good safety protocols alone does not put his mind at rest. David A. Relman, a microbiologist at Stanford University, said if the only available information is provided by the very people who have everything to lose by revealing such evidence, it doesn't come close to passing the sniff test. Relman suggested that the WHO team should have sought complete, detailed records from the laboratories about their experiments and the raw genomic sequence data of their research going back a decade. The Russian ambassador in Pyongyang revealed there is a severe shortage of daily necessities in North Korea due to the country's border lockdowns and import suspensions to prevent the entry of COVID-19. The Russian diplomat said the communist state has no other choice but to stay locked up, as it does not have the necessary medical resources to fight the virus. Mark Wilson Che reports.
Speaking to Russia's Interfax news agency on Monday, Russian ambassador to North Korea Alexander Matsegura said foreign diplomats in Pyongyang are experiencing a shortage of necessities due to border lockdowns against COVID-19. The ambassador said many embassy staff have left the communist state since the lockdowns were imposed in January of last year. Imports of raw materials were completely halted in September, forcing businesses to close and people to lose jobs. For the diplomats who have decided to stay, they have been banned from traveling outside Pyongyang since January of last year, and their children are not allowed to leave the embassy premises. While foreigners are permitted to access around 300 stores and one market in Pyongyang, as the blockade lengthened, it has become difficult to buy necessities such as flour and sugar. Prices have also tripled or quadrupled. Russian embassy employees have begun exchanging clothes and shoes with each other for their growing children and are experiencing a shortage of medicine. Matsegura said Pyongyang publicly admits that it cannot lift the lockdowns due to a lack of medical facilities and resources to counter a possible COVID-19 outbreak. He, however, forecasts the blockades to be partially eased in the future as the North is building large disinfection facilities along its borders with Russia and China to resume imports. Marcos Che, KBS World Radio News.
The benchmark Korea Composite Stock Price Index rose 15.91 points, or 0.52% on Wednesday, to close at 3,100.58. The tech-heavy Kosdaq also rose, gaining 6.46 points, or 0.67%, to close at 964.31. On the foreign exchange, the local currency strengthened 9.6 won against the dollar, ending the session at 1,107 won.
And now, with round-the-clock updates from Reuters journalists, here are today's top stories.
At least one person was killed in Minnesota clinic shooting.
This is Reuters Now.
4 people were wounded and 1 has died after an elderly man opened fire inside a Minneapolis area health clinic on Tuesday. Law enforcement officials described the gunman as a disgruntled former patient. Police believe he acted alone in the attack. Sheriff Sean Derringer.
So I will identify the suspect as Gregory Paul Ulrich. He's 67 years old. He is from Buffalo. We do believe that Mr. Ulrich did act alone. We're not looking for any additional suspects.
Ulrich was taken into custody after Tuesday's violence, which included an explosion 30 minutes after the shooting. That's according to local media reports citing emergency dispatch audio. Authorities told reporters that they weren't able to confirm the reports of an explosion, and that there was no reason to believe it was a terrorist attack. Ulrich had been well known to authorities, receiving complaints as far back as 2003. Buffalo's chief of police said the attack was most likely related to an unspecified past conflict between the suspect and local healthcare providers. Ulrich was scheduled to appear for arraignment related to that case on Thursday. Sheriff Derringer said bomb squad investigators were called to the scene to examine a suspicious package found in the corner of the clinic's lobby and additional devices found at a nearby motel where Ulrich had been staying. The 5 people wounded in the attack were taken to hospitals, but it's not known whether the victims were clinic patients or staff. One later died, according to the county's medical spokeswoman.
She said, "Dad, I don't want to come back to the Capitol."
Emotional accounts of the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol and an uneven and at times loud defense
I make no apology.
were presented to the 100-seat Senate on Tuesday, the first day of the historic second impeachment trial of Donald Trump, the only former president to be tried in the Senate after leaving office.
I'll show you.
Tuesday's dramatic proceedings began with lead impeachment trial manager Jamie Raskin premiering a highly produced and graphic 13-minute video showing scenes of Trump backers violently breaching the Capitol, juxtaposed with images of the alarmed lawmakers inside.
Stop the steal.
And using Trump's own words against him.
This cannot be the future of America.
The day one arguments centered on the question of whether holding a trial after Trump left office violates the U.S. Constitution. Trump's lead defense lawyer, Bruce Castor, said the Senate did not have jurisdiction to conduct the trial, but admitted his team had to change its strategy after the impeachment managers made their case.
I'll be quite frank with you. We changed what we were going to do on account that we thought that the House manager's presentation was well done.
A majority of the Senate voted to move forward with a trial on a charge of inciting the deadly Capitol riot. 6 Republicans joined the Democrats to say the trial was constitutional, including Senator Bill Cassidy, who was the only Republican to switch his vote to support proceeding with the trial, calling the Trump lawyers' opening statements disorganized and random, adding, quote, "The House managers made a compelling, cogent case, and the president's team did not."
Toyota is shrugging off a global shortage of chips that has forced rivals.
This is AP News. I'm Rita Foley. The White House says President Biden isn't watching the Senate impeachment hearings, but former President Trump is, and he's said to be fuming about the performance of his legal team. AP Washington correspondent Sagar Magani.
The ex-president watched the debate from his Florida club and was furious with his team, though Bruce Castor defended himself.
I thought we had a good day.
GOP senators, though, are ripping his meandering showing.
Couldn't figure out where he was going.
I thought I knew where he was going, and I really didn't know where he was going.
I don't think it was very persuasive.
It was disorganized, random.
Louisiana's Bill Cassidy called it a terrible job and was the sole Republican who voted against pursuing the trial last week to flip this time. 56 senators in all voted to move ahead. 67 are needed for a conviction. Sagar Magani, Washington.
Today, opening arguments in the Senate impeachment trial of former President Trump, who's charged with inciting the insurrection at the U.S. Capitol building. Chicago's teachers have approved a deal with the city to return to class as the nation battles the coronavirus pandemic. The first wave of students in pre-K and special ed are due.
Sister Andre is about to turn 117. She tested positive. Sister Andre says she didn't realize she...
The weather's fierce in Paris and across much of northern Europe. AP correspondent Charles de Ledesma reports.
Workers at the Eiffel Tower have had to use blowtorches to melt the ice collecting on its surfaces. The cold snap has also led to snow blocking roads and halting trains and school buses across northern France. In some areas, highways have been closed for lack of snow clearing equipment. Other parts of Central and Northern Europe too, as well as Britain, have been gripped by a cold weather front since the weekend. Heavy snowfall has tangled traffic and stranded cars in Germany and the Czech Republic. I'm Charles de Ledesma.
A lock of George Washington's hair is among the items going to auction ahead of President's Day, and a photograph of Lincoln signed by him. Also a pen Warren Harding used to end U.S. involvement in World War I. Bidding begins tomorrow at the RR Auction House. I'm Rita Foley, AP News.
And now a game of commercial chicken.
This morning, America's first news starts right after this. Do you own or rent your home? Sure you do. Fortunately, Tom Closa sides on the facts of the case. All 50 Democrats, only a handful of Republicans have indicated they likely would vote guilty. On the other side, Mr. Trump's lawyers acknowledged the horror of January 6th, but said the trial was unconstitutionally targeting their client. They also cast doubt on the Democrats' motives for calling the trial constitutional. Attorney Bruce Castor said, quote, "We're really here because the majority of the House of Representatives doesn't want to face Donald Trump as a political rival in the future." But Republican senators like Bill Cassidy of Louisiana were unimpressed with Mr. Trump's attorneys.
President Trump's team were disorganized. They did everything they could but to talk about the question at hand. And when they talked about it, they kind of glided over it, almost as if they were embarrassed of their arguments. Starting later today, both sides will each get up to 16 hours for presentations over several days. Both sides will also have the option to call for a debate and vote on calling witnesses. Mr. Trump has declined a request to testify. If there's a guilty verdict, the Senate Democrats plan to hold a vote to disqualify Mr. Trump from running again for president. Well, Congressman Jamie Raskin of Maryland is the two-term representative, now in the spotlight as the chief prosecutor in former President Trump's impeachment trial in the Senate.
President Trump has sent his lawyers here today to try to stop the Senate from hearing the facts of this case. They want to call the trial over before any evidence is even introduced.
In the eyes of many Democrats, Mr. Raskin is the perfect adversary of the man they view as the most negative force in American politics. Alex Swoyer, legal affairs reporter for The Washington Times, says the 45th president and the Maryland Democrat have starkly different views about the Constitution and American politics. Alex, what did you find?
It's interesting because, of course, when you do a profile like this, depending on who you talk to, you're going to get either positive or negative.
Here's your morning brief for Tuesday, February 9th. I'm Keith Collins for The Wall Street Journal. Former President Donald Trump's second impeachment trial formally starts today. It's expected to begin with a brief debate and vote on the trial's constitutionality, followed by several days of presentations that could include witnesses. Trump's lawyers have argued the proceedings are unconstitutional because he is no longer president and denounced the case as, quote, political theater. Democrats have said Trump is trying to escape accountability for allegedly inciting last month's riot at the U.S. Capitol. House Democrats propose sending $1,400 direct relief payments to Americans without lowering the income thresholds from previous coronavirus aid packages. Democrats also propose extending a weekly $400 supplemental unemployment benefit through August 29th. The measures are headed for a vote by the House Ways and Means Committee this week. Social media company Reddit doubled its valuation to $6 billion after it said it raised $250 million in a new round of funding. This comes as the company has added users and gained attention for its role in the recent Wall Street trading frenzy involving GameStop and other heavily shorted stocks.
Democrats begin making their case today against former President Donald Trump. We'll tell you just how much time they'll have to present their side. Plus, how a surefire bet on billionaire entrepreneur Jack Ma's financial technology giant ended up trapping some of the world's biggest investors.
They are in limbo and they are essentially stuck. They have practically no other option but to wait.
And why diamond prices may reveal a bright spot in the pandemic economy. It's Wednesday, February 10th. I'm Mark Stewart with the Wall Street Journal, and this is What's News.
The Transport Secretary Grant Shapps has suggested that vaccine passports could be needed for international travel. He said the government had been talking to other countries about introducing a system to check whether travellers had been vaccinated or tested, but he ruled out a similar system being used for activities in the UK, such as going to the pub. In the next hour, the government is expected to outline further funding for the removal of unsafe cladding on buildings after the Grenfell Tower fire in 2017. Ministers announced a £1.6 billion safety fund last year, but thousands of flat owners are still facing huge bills for fixing fire safety faults. The Conservative MP Stephen McPartland says the responsibility for the works lies with other people.
We have to.
BBC News. A burgeoning number of protesters in Myanmar appear to be defying the authorities.
A Texas court hearing being conducted via Zoom took a detour when one of the attorneys showed up looking like a kitten.
Mr. Ponton, I believe you have a filter turned on in the video settings.
Judge Roy Ferguson sized the situation up quickly.
Can you hear me, Judge?
As Presidio County Attorney Rod Ponton spoke, the lips moving beneath the adorable big eyes were those of a fluffy white kitten.
I'm here live. I'm not a cat.
I can see that. I think if you click the up arrow.
Judge Ferguson shared the video on YouTube, advising lawyers and anyone taking part in court proceedings to always check for filters before logging on. Ponton told the AP somewhat ruefully he always wanted to be famous for being a great lawyer. Instead, it's his legal take on cats. I'm Ben Thomas.
London Stock Exchange Group is here to be your essential. If Gabrielle Chanel's life for a playlist, it would start with the hymns of her childhood and jump to the cabaret that gave her the nickname Coco. Next up, a bel canto aria played on her own grand piano, and of course, the Beatles live in London with jazz and blues and Johnny Halliday and Stravinsky in between. The playlist would close with a song from Coco, the Broadway musical that starred Katharine Hepburn in the title role. Watch the film that explores this eclectic, refined musical journey on InsideChanel.com.
Hello and welcome to the History Extra podcast from BBC History Magazine, Britain's best-selling history magazine. I'm Ellie Cawthorne. Slavery and the British Empire have proven to be some of history's most debated subjects in recent years. And on today's episode, we'll be exploring how the two were intertwined. Joining me for today's conversation was Patrick Scanlon, author of Slave Empire: How Slavery Built Modern Britain, who told me about the ways that slavery fueled the British Empire and some of the complicated motivations of abolitionists. So your new book, Slave Empire, it looks at the ways in which Britain and its empire was powered by slavery, and it also looks at how anti-slavery and abolition were much more complicated than we might first assume. What are some of the biggest conceptions about Britain's abolition of slavery that you've come across?
So I think most people understand that British imperial history is entangled with slavery, that Britain's colonies in the Atlantic world, in the Caribbean, in the colonies that became the United States, made extensive use of enslaved labor, particularly in the 18th century. But I think there's a kind of national myth in Britain that Britain may have been a very enthusiastic slave trader and a very enthusiastic employer of enslaved labor, but that in the 19th century, Britain turned against slavery and kind of reversed the polarity of its empire. It went from being an empire devoted to slavery to an empire devoted to freedom. And not only an empire that abolished slavery, but an empire that actively kind of prosecuted anti-slavery wars. And I think that's just not true. And one of the core arguments of my book, Slave Empire, is that you can't understand the anti-slavery movement in Britain without understanding the ways that it is entangled with the rise of the British Empire in the 18th century. So Britain built its empire, this empire that in the Victorian era was very proudly an empire of free trade, free labor, and political freedom throughout the world. But that empire was entangled with and couldn't be separated from the empire that was built on slavery in the 18th century. So the institutions of British imperial power, especially in the Atlantic world, were built on slavery. And those foundations survived the abolition of slavery. So the idea that anti-slavery reversed the British Empire and turned it from kind of from an empire of slavery into an empire of liberty just isn't true.
Yeah, I think that is one of the most fascinating aspects of your book. This idea that Britain used abolition in the narrative about itself to say, we have learned from the past and now we're morally superior. How did that take on abolition, that idea that Britain had moved beyond slavery and become morally superior, actually help aid imperialist aims?
Well, let me give you an example. So in the 1850s and 1860s, Britain had abandoned its association with enslaved labor, since the abolition of colonial slavery in the 1830s, since the abolition of the British slave trade in 1807. But in West Africa, Britain had ambitions, or British merchants had ambitions of taking over the palm oil trade. And so one of the kind of key reasons for the British takeover of what became eventually the Nigeria Protectorate, so the kind of shelling of Lagos in the 1860s, was anti-slavery. So Britain was able to, in the name of abolishing the slave trade and in the name of enforcing the abolition of the slave trade, was able to effectively, seize territory, especially in West Africa. And that's a kind of very specific example, but anti-slavery gave impetus to all kinds of projects for British imperial reform. And if you want to think of a kind of core ideological foundation of the Victorian British Empire, it was this idea of civilization, right? That Britain represented the summit of civilization, and that Britain's role as an empire was to teach civilization to either the places that it conquered directly, the places where it sent settlers by the millions, or the places where its economic influence reached. And that idea of civilization got a lot of power from anti-slavery, right? What better proof of Britain's moral superiority than Britain's claim to have been the first European empire to have disengaged itself first from the slave trade and then from slavery. So that concept was a really powerful one in the Victorian Empire of the 19th century. And it kind of put the lie to the fact of Britain's continuing involvement in slavery in the 19th century. So, I mean, the kind of core product of industrializing Britain was with cotton. And Britain's primary source of raw cotton was the United States of America. And cotton in the U.S. was overwhelmingly produced by enslaved laborers in the American South. And at the same time, the other kind of core product that Britain offered to the world in the 19th century was financial services. And so Britons didn't own enslaved people or claim to own enslaved people, but plenty of British investors owned, for example, bonds issued by the states in the by the southern states in the U.S., states that were founded on enslaved labor and on the kind of power of slaveholders. And so just to give one final example, so in 1837, in part because of adjustments to the interest rates made by the Bank of England to benefit British investors, there was a wave of bankruptcies across the United States, the Panic of 1837. And one of the features of slaveholding, both in the 18th century when it was a major institution in the British Empire, and in the 19th century when it was no longer officially part of the British Empire, but absolutely deeply connected to British imperial interests, was heavy debt, right? To be a slaveholder was to be heavily mortgaged. And so fluctuations in interest rates would mean bankruptcies. And in 1837, slaveholders across the American South went bankrupt. And for an enslaved person, a bankruptcy could mean a family separation. It could mean the kind of destruction of whatever very fragile stability an enslaved person might have living on a plantation, right? Because if a slaveholder went bankrupt, they would liquidate their estate, which would also include the claims they made in human beings. And there were British and American abolitionists met in 1840 at the World Anti-Slavery Conference, and American abolitionists complained. They said, Britain can claim to be an anti-slavery empire, but when the slaveholders and American states defaulted in 1837, Britons benefited from that because they were able to effectively own bonds in the American South and then sell them when it was profitable to do so.
NBC News Radio, I'm Michael Kastner. The White House is adjusting President Biden's goal of opening most U.S. public schools within 100 days. Press Secretary Jen Psaki.
His goal that he set is to have the majority of schools, so more than 50%, open by day 100 of his presidency. And that means some teaching in classrooms. So at least one day a week. Hopefully it's more.
Last December, Biden said his goal to defeat the pandemic would ensure that a majority of schools would be open within 100 days. On his first full day in office, however, the White House said the plan didn't apply to high schools. One person is dead and at least 3 others are wounded after a shooting at a Minnesota healthcare clinic. The shooting spree happened yesterday in the town of Buffalo, about 40 miles northwest of Minneapolis. 67-year-old suspect has been taken into custody. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers will be celebrating their Super Bowl victory with a boat parade. Today's parade will float down the Hillsborough River starting at 1 p.m. Eastern. Michael Kastner, NBC News Radio.
Call 1-888
free 2-hour grocery delivery. That means no masks, no park, no where did I drop your shoe in the store again. No, that's exactly what it means.
USA Radio News with Lance Pride.
The second impeachment of President Trump will move forward.
On this vote, the yeas are 56, the nays are 44, and pursuant to S. 47, the Senate having voted in the affirmative on the foregoing question, the Senate shall proceed.
Contra Costa County authorities issued a public health advisory Tuesday afternoon after a Chevron refinery in Richmond, California began spilling petroleum into the San Francisco Bay. A spokesman for Chevron said refinery employees noticed a sheen in the water about 3 p.m. Pacific and alerted authorities. The leak was stopped about 5 p.m. after dumping roughly 600 gallons of a petroleum and water mixture. Richmond is about 9 miles northeast of the Golden Gate Bridge. The United Arab Emirates Hope probe successfully made it into orbit around Mars Tuesday, enlisting the Arab nation into an elite class of spacefaring nations. With Hope, the UAE is now the 5th nation to operate an orbiter around Mars. USA Radio News. While the nation is enthralled on a new Trump impeachment, some lawmakers in Washington are trying to get COVID relief to the American people. USA Radio News' Tim Berg has more.
The White House is continuing to urge lawmakers to get the proposed COVID-19 rescue plan to President Biden's desk. Press Secretary Jen Psaki said multiple business leaders and experts believe the rescue plan will get the economy to recover quicker than the current projections. Republicans think the $1.9 trillion price tag is too expensive. Republican Senator John Cornyn also saying,
we're in favor of targeted relief that deals with the COVID-19 pandemic. And the number that the president has given us is a absurdly high number. It's not targeted on people who need it the most.
That audio courtesy of Fox News from the USA Radio News Phoenix Bureau. I'm Tim Berg.
In January, Democratic Majority Leader Chuck Schumer said a plan will be available by late March. USA Radio News. Although House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has no idea how much the first failed impeachment of President Trump cost taxpayers, conservative estimates put the number at $32 million. And here we go again. How much treasure and waste of time when other pressing issues are paramount will the government spend for a second impeachment trial? USA Radio News' Dan Araki has more.
Arguments will continue Wednesday in former President Trump's second impeachment trial, with each side being given 16 hours to make their case. Senator Ted Cruz says the week will be nothing more than political theater. The Texas Republican tells Fox News that every senator knows the trial will end in acquittal, but Democrats remain focused on President Trump instead of the issues facing the nation.
It is going to end with the president being acquitted. In order for the president to be convicted, it takes 67 votes in the U.S. Senate. That's not going to happen. It's not going to get 67 votes. It's not going to get close to 67 votes. Every one of the 100 senators knows that. Every one of the House managers knows that. But this is political theater because rather than address the real problems, the real challenges we have in this country, rather than focus on getting kids back in school and getting tens of millions of Americans back to work, the Democrats want a week of just political theater raging at Donald Trump.
From the USA Radio News Ohio Bureau, I'm Dan Naraki.
The Senate voted 56-44 to move forward with the impeachment. The Senate convenes at noon Eastern. For USA Radio News, I'm Lance Pry.
You want a Diet Coke from McDonald's for breakfast, but think it's too early.